Hans-Jakob Schindler. He's the Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project. Welcome back to DW, Hans. It's great to see you. Now, a senior Hamas official has accused Israel of pushing things back to square one after they cut aid flowing into Gaza. Is the deal effectively dead in your eyes?
Well, I mean, the deal isn't dead, but what it's over is phase one, where it was a really clear timeline, clearly outlined actions by both sides. And now we are in phase two, and what haunts this implementation of phase two is really that there has not yet been a decision of what is going to happen to Gaza, who is going to run it, in what form, with what security forces. And that's why we are in this weird limbo state where Israel's actions are not really violating the deal. They're violating potentially the spirit of the deal. But of course, it's also clear that what Hamas is doing is systematically trying to steal these humanitarian efforts so that they become the main provider of food in Gaza in order to secure their own political survival. And it looks like Israel is going to try to counter this with this new decision.
Yet Hamas is, of course, keen to survive this. They've expressed their willingness to start negotiating phase two, but remaining a force in Gaza. What shape or form do you think that could take? Is this a realistic aspiration? Is that something that Israel would ever allow? What do you make of that?
Yeah, I mean, for the first time, we see actually publicly some internal disagreements within Hamas. A couple of days ago, Abu Mazruk, a not in Gaza-based, outside Gaza-based member of the political office of Hamas, said if it would have been clear what the reaction to October 7th would have been, there wouldn't have been no October 7th. The Qassam brigades apparently in Gaza are not willing to give up their weapons. Others in Gaza want the Qassam brigades. Other Hamas forces in Gaza want to give up. That the Qassam brigade gives up their weapons. So there is actually, for the first time, visible internal dissent in Hamas. What all of them have in common, of course, is something that Israel said it would not accept, is they want the organization to survive inside Gaza. Some say it's good enough if we're just a political force, we can rebuild later. Others, like the Qassam brigade, say, no, we need to keep a couple of our weapons to rebuild faster. So it's really unclear at this point who in Hamas wants what and who has the authority to actually speak for Hamas as a terrorist group.
Mm-hmm. Talking about the future, Prime Minister Netanyahu said today that it was time to give Palestinians, and I'm quoting him here, the freedom to leave Gaza. In light of the stalled negotiations and the messaging coming out of the White House recently, what do you make of statements like this one?
Yeah, well, I mean, the same question as when President Trump suggested that Gazan residents should leave is where to? Egypt and Jordan have absolutely not yet accepted a displacement of Gazan civilians in their country. So there is really no place for them to leave right now. Of course, I can see that less Palestinians in Gaza may be a preferential option for the Israeli or maybe even the US government, but there is no country willing to take them.
That's Hans-Jakob Schindler, Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project. Thank you so much.
Let's speak about this more with Dahlia Scheindlin, a political analyst and fellow at the Century Foundation, joining us today from Tel Aviv. Thank you so much for taking the time. With Israel restricting aid into Gaza, a senior Hamas official has accused Israel of pushing things back to square one. Could this derail the entire deal?
Absolutely. I mean, the entire deal has already been derailed because the sides have not entered into negotiations over the second phase, as they were originally supposed to after in the middle of the first phase, which has long passed. So the second phase was supposed to see Israel redeploying its forces and the rest of the hostages released, and the third phase leading to a complete end of the war. That has already fallen by the wayside. What's in play now is a new plan that Israel has attributed to Steve Witkoff, the special envoy of President Trump, saying essentially that the major condition, and in fact, one of the major features of the original plan is gone. And that feature was a commitment to a permanent ceasefire. So the new arrangement would have said Hamas releases half of the hostages at the beginning of another, month-long phase, half the hostages at the end in return for a ceasefire, but there is no commitment to the end of to a permanent ceasefire at the end of the war. And that has always been Hamas's ongoing demand from these negotiations. So right now we're frankly at a stalemate, and it looks very much like there is a high likelihood that all of these options will collapse and there will be a return to the fighting. And Israel has announced, regularly over the last few days that it is preparing for that eventuality.
Why do you think we saw this suggestion from the Trump administration, and why do you think Netanyahu would be eager to take it up?
Well, I can't speak for the mind of the Trump administration, certainly not for the mind of President Trump, but I can say that there has definitely been a great deal of agreement and backing between the United States and Netanyahu following Benjamin Netanyahu's visit. He was the first foreign leader received by President Trump, and they clearly had plenty to agree on. And what it looks like is that, after having given what for Netanyahu was a concession to go for the first phase of this hostage release ceasefire deal, that now Netanyahu is able to move ahead in changing the rules of the game for the negotiations with the full backing of the Trump administration. Who actually initiated it, I don't know. I cannot say whether it was genuinely coming from Steve Witkoff or whether it was coming from Netanyahu. But I think the reality is that throughout this entire time, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has not wanted to reach a complete ceasefire. He has avoided that at all costs. He has essentially prioritized the demands, the unrelenting and rather unwavering demands of his own coalition partners, who are dead set against any commitment to ending the war, even at the expense of hostages. This is not me saying so, but ministers in the government saying that the hostages' lives can be sacrificed for the sake of continuing the war, because they see that as the only way to destroy Hamas. And frankly, they're open about their intentions to conquer Gaza, annex it, and rebuild settlements. The Trump administration, as we know, has released wild-sounding plans, but essentially leading in a direction that has nothing to do with Palestinian statehood or self-determination, but involves either expulsion of Palestinians, an American takeover, or, failing that, what Israel wants.
Well, looking back at what Netanyahu has said here, his office has threatened Hamas with additional consequences if they continue to refuse to agree to this altered version of a deal. What exactly do you think he might have in mind there?
Again, I don't think we know exactly what he has in mind, but let me just start with what's happening over the last few days. The shutdown from yesterday of humanitarian aid, which is a violation of international law. It is bargaining and weaponizing the humanitarian situation of people who are non-combatants. And frankly, it can't be expected to succeed. Nothing about the fate of Palestinians or the 50,000 who have been killed up until now has swayed Hamas. So I'm not sure why anybody thinks that this would place leverage on Hamas, because somehow the people are going to get upset and rebel, as they have not been able to do over the last 16, 17 years. What we know going forward is that the implication is that the Netanyahu government wants to restart the war. And it has been in a sort of holding pattern over the last, certainly during the ceasefire and even before then. And so we can imagine that they will simply, what they're saying is that they will restart the war full force. Exactly what that means in the operational context, we don't know yet.
Yeah. Thank you so much for joining us on DW with your insights. We've been speaking with Dahlia Scheindlin, a political analyst and fellow at the Century Foundation.